In the year 1901, a young college professor, Aurobindo Ghosh, married Mrinalini Devi in an arranged marriage as per Hindu custom. They spent a year together in Baroda, where Ghosh was employed. But soon, he would be involved in political activities for the independence of India from British rule. Living with his wife now became dangerous. Mrinalini had to go back to her father's home and could not return to Baroda despite her overwhelming desire to live with her husband. This led to years of separation between husband and wife. For over a decade, the couple only lived together intermittently as Aurobindo shifted from Baroda to Calcutta and finally to the French territory of Pondicherry in southern India. During this time, Aurobindo Ghosh, once a civil servant and college professor, then a freedom fighter and revolutionary, now became known as the great mystic, philosopher and poet Sri Aurobindo. Finally, in the year 1918, Sri Aurobindo reached out to Mrinalini, deciding to end their long separation, and invited her to his emerging ashram in Pondicherry. "My sadhana is over. I have achieved my object, Siddhi. You can come now and be my companion in this work." This letter excited Mrinalini, and she decided to immediately travel and join her husband. But as Mrinalini traveled from her family's house in Shillong all the way to Pondicherry, she fell a victim to the influenza pandemic during her journey. After a week's illness in Calcutta, on the way to Pondicherry, she tragically passed away at the age of 32. A relative of Mrinalini, who was present in the Pondicherry ashram at the time, wrote to her mother, "Today, I saw tears in the eyes of your stone-hearted son-in-law." With the telegram relating the passing of Mrinalini in one hand, he sat still and tears were in his eyes. The tale of Mrinalini Devi's demise and its impact in Sri Aurobindo educates us about how even a great yogi must deal with personal losses and their impact. In ordinary individuals, grief can lead to periods of depression, which can only be overcome with great effort. Sri Aurobindo himself, interestingly, wrote extensively about how a spiritual practitioner must get rid of all depression. For Sri Aurobindo, depression represented a hostile force which attempts to take over the psyche of a spiritual person, preventing them from reaching greater heights of realization. In this video, we'll discuss Sri Aurobindo's description of the real reason why depression takes hold of an individual. Later in this video, we'll also discuss his advice on how we can overcome the hold of depression and all other negative and hostile forces that stand between us and enlightenment. The first thing that Sri Aurobindo instructed to his disciples was that one must always remember that depression comes from outside, not inside. This implies that depression is an outside hostile force which attacks us and creates the illusion within ourselves that this depression comes from our own mind. In his Letters on Yoga, Sri Aurobindo provides extensive guidance on the topic of depression. He cautions one disciple as follows: "If the mind does not respond to outer things, depression is impossible. The self at one end, the stone at the other never get into depression." This implies that humanity, lying in the process of evolution in between the inert matter of a stone and the full consciousness of the self, is alone open to hostile forces which can impact our behavior. It is only when our mind is open to outside forces and responds to them without realizing their hostility that we fall into depression. This process of outside forces attacking us also takes place through conversation with other individuals, particularly when we speak to a person who has a deep depression, a low vitality, or any other signs of negative energy. Sri Aurobindo believed that such a person can even bring down our own vitality to restore theirs. He writes to a disciple, "Naturally, the deep depression and low vitality in another person try to get into you. The person pulls your vital force to restore hers, or you yourself part with it for that purpose. You feel exhausted and empty afterwards. One person may produce more of this result than another. This should caution us about associating with people who possess a negative energy. Entering into relations with such individuals can drag us down with them into the pit of despair and helplessness, while they may profit from our energy. If conversation alone with such a person can drag us down, one must wonder how harmful physical relations with them would be. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "Directly after copulation, the devil's laughter is heard." Could this laughter be coming from the person lying next to us? In fact, later in this video, we will discuss Sri Aurobindo's claim that many of us actually, deep down inside, want to remain depressed. From this, it follows that one must attempt to cultivate an inner strength which would close our mind to the outside hostile forces that create depression within us. Silence and solitude are two key aspects for retaining our spiritual energies and avoiding a downfall towards depression. Sri Aurobindo cautions his followers to not let ourselves get depressed and lose our patience in the spiritual pursuit. One must recognize that our external being, implying our body and its desires, is always difficult to tame. He continues, "It has to be dealt with by patience and a quiet and cheerful perseverance. Never get depressed by its resistance, for that only makes it discouraged. Give it rather the encouragement of sunlight and a quiet pressure, and one day you will find it opening entirely to the grace." The inner silence is crucial for being patient with our spiritual journey and not becoming frustrated with lack of results. But how does one cultivate inner silence? Sri Aurobindo explains, "Silence is always good, but I do not mean by quietness of mind entire silence. I mean a mind free from disturbance and trouble, steady, light and glad, so as to be open to the force that will change the nature. The important thing is to get rid of the habit of the invasion of troubling thoughts, wrong feelings, confusion of ideas, unhappy movements. These disturb the nature and cloud it and make it more difficult for the force to work. When the mind is quiet and at peace, the force can work more easily." Many of us today, while not going through depression, may still indulge in nihilistic viewpoints. Sri Aurobindo, however, believes that nihilism, or the feeling that life is meaningless, is only another aspect of depression. Just like depression then, nihilism must also be set aside for a complete surrender to the divine purpose. He wrote to one follower, "This kind of dejection, feeling that life is meaningless, must be cast aside. Life always has a meaning, whether in success or in difficulty, so long as it is turned towards the divine. Protection will be given, but depression must be put aside so that you may be able to receive and use the help and the force." From this, we can understand that our lives are only meaningless when they are not spiritual. All that takes place in our life can only have meaning if we have surrendered ourselves to the divine. Once the surrender has been performed, Sri Aurobindo argues, everything in our life acquires a new meaning. Even the suffering that we experience becomes a challenge that we must overcome for our spiritual advancement. So, if we should cultivate silence and reject all feelings of dejection and nihilism, what are the feelings that we should cultivate in order to progress in our spiritual practice? Sri Aurobindo wrote to one of his disciples a letter that explained the foundations of the sadhana or spiritual practice taught by him. This is what he wrote: "If you have a growing faith that all that is happening has somehow to happen and that God knows what is best for you, that is already a great thing. If you add to it the will to keep your face always turned towards the goal and the confidence that you're being led towards it even through difficulties and apparent denials, there could be no better mental foundation for sadhana." But the question then arises, what is stopping us from this mental foundation for spiritual practice? Why can we not accept that all that is happening is the best for us and avoid the hostile forces which create our depression? Sri Aurobindo makes another point which should caution us about how we view our depressive tendencies. In a letter to a follower, Sri Aurobindo claims that we may even like our depression and want to remain depressed. He writes, "Nobody doubts that your external consciousness dislikes its suffering. The physical mind and consciousness of man hates its own suffering, and if left to itself, dislikes also to see others suffer. But if you go deep enough, you'll find that there's something in the vital which likes suffering and clings to it for the sake of the drama. The mind and the physical of man do not like suffering, for if they did, it would not be suffering any longer. But this thing in the vital wants it in order to give a spice to life. This is the reason why constant depressions can go on returning and returning, even though the mind longs to get rid of them." This shocking statement tells us about another cause for depression. Even if our physical mind is not open to the hostile forces of depression, our vital force, or prana, may be open to depression and suffering, only because it wants to add drama to our existence. Hence, deep down inside, we may want depression. Perhaps the only way to get rid of this tendency is to either quieten our pranic energy or to actually suffer through a deep depression and come out of it with a desire to attain greater spiritual heights. This has immense parallels to the dark night of the soul, which we had discussed in our video on vertigo. Sometime after Mrinalini passed away, Sri Aurobindo, in a letter to his father-in-law, described his grief due to the event and how he viewed Mrinalini's death in the cosmic cycle. "My dear father-in-law, I've not written to you with regard to the fatal event in both our lives. Words are useless in face of the feelings it has caused. God has seen good to lay upon me the one sorrow that could still touch me to the center. He knows better than ourselves what is best for each of us. And now that the first sense of the irreparable has passed, I can bow with submission to His divine purpose." From his letter, we can perceive the deep grief in which Mrinalini's death left him. But of course, as the great yogi that he was, Sri Aurobindo perceived the divine purpose behind all that takes place in the world. In his advice to his disciples on depression, Sri Aurobindo encouraged them to also view the divine purpose behind all that exists. Even depression, while being a hostile force, is ultimately to be seen as a starting point, which is to be overcome for attaining a higher spiritual experience. Sri Aurobindo wrote to one disciple, "I think the best thing I can write to you in the circumstances is to recommend you an aphorism. Depression need not be depressing. Rather, it should be made a jumping board for the leap to a higher and happier poise." This advice is a great note to end this video. Have you ever experienced depression? How did you emerge out of it? Let us know in the comments below.